So, my name is Kavya, and I live in the eastern part of the country. The state is called Orissa, and I am beautifully placed in a forest. And probably, if I have to buy my groceries, I need to drive about 80, 90 kilometers, which is a next state of Andhra, Vishakhapatnam, which is closest to my village. And it's a beautiful experience. It did not start like that. I'll cover a bit of this interesting story, which has become to what I am today, but also talk about something relevant, which is indigenous tourism, or you may call tribal tourism, or you may say impact tourism. There are different terminologies, basis how we want to project it. A lot of myths around it. The data is misleading, and also would want to talk how can we mindfully merge it, and what is the current scenario. A disclaimer that I get a little too honest. I'll try to be, when I get a little too honest, I am like, usually, no, Kavya, don't put it out, because, working in grassroots opens you up to a lot of realities which we don't come to see when we are living in cities and having a different kind of research based understanding of these indigenous clusters. And yeah, let's go for it. And before I actually put myself into it, what's the time right now? Okay, it's 11:16. We're starting a little late, but I'll try to keep it on time. This is just a visual thing, just to give you an idea of the kind of villages we are surrounded with. More once we start. Thank you, Sameer. We have a little deck over here, but it's mostly because I battle a short term memory and I tend to forget things. So I made it for myself so that I don't miss any context, but also happy to answer anything you have in your mind after the little talk. So, welcome everyone once again. We are talking about indigenous identities and allied tourism around it, particularly in the context of India and also probably Asia. But I'll stick to India for today because it's too vast a tapestry to talk about in a limited time. And to right away jump on it, I would want to talk about myself. But before that, yes, it was a mere turmeric that changed my life. Um, I was born in Rajasthan and spent almost three-fourths of my life. Today I'm 36 in Delhi, and a very Delhi bred, high flying career of sorts in different corporates and but I always had this interest towards traveling in the rural belts. And I think with like a lot of people, pandemic changed a lot in us. While travel was mostly interest and leisure for me, it did not translate to something that was impactful, that actually led to making a tangible impact. It was only after pandemic I was firing a lot of people. It was unfortunate times for the entire earth. I realized that what am I doing? If I really love the rural ecosystems, I should rather be there full time And if it's not, then probably I'm just faking it for the gram or for the Facebook. And it was one of the projects I took with Mahindra. That was October 2020. And the whole idea was to cover certain rural villages in the eastern part of the country, which are not so exposed in terms of content, stories, and also the kind of body of work that they are doing. So, leaving my comfort zone, which was more of North, Delhi, Gujarat, Rajasthan, the Ladakh, Spiti, a bit of Uttarakhand, I moved to the eastern part of the country. So, I focused on Bengal. Orissa was never on my mind. It happened. I focused a bit on Chhattisgarh, a beautiful state that's coming up in terms of tourism. And then, of course, the northeastern states, you have Nagaland, a huge way, Arunachal Pradesh. Now I'm associated with them in a big way. So yeah, and I still remember it was Jan 2021. I entered Orissa, if you see the map of India, through the Chhattisgarh Andhra border. And I entered this district of Koraput. And for me, it was like James Cameron's Avatar that came in front of me. Like there were rolling hills and forests, and I saw these Adivasi people living exactly the way they used to see centuries before. And I'd never seen such a thing. I mean, considering that called I used to call myself well traveled to the Spitis and the Himalayas. I used to even be a motorsport buff, traveling to the interiors of the desert for documentation, worked for Indian Museum, but I had just touched the tip when I came to this entire belt, which is like a triangle. If you see the Indian map from South Orissa all the way to Chhattisgarh and upwards to Jharkhand, and then permeating it to Bihar. And that opened the doors for me. And initially, it was just, my decision to move my life there full time. And in few months, I realized, oh, I got carried away because I was this pasta eating, bread eating girl in Delhi who was fascinated with the rural ecosystem, but I'd never lived in it full time. And I went into this zone that probably it was a decision I shouldn't have taken. It took me like 6 months to understand the fabric. And when it did, it changed my life. I used to frequent these Adivasi Haats, which is still a very beautiful norm in the eastern and northeastern part of the country, where weekly there are different weekly markets where congregation of tribal communities come down to sell their goods, and a lot of barter system is still practiced to date as we are speaking. And it was there I figured out that this belt is producing enormous amounts of turmeric, so much that it is not able to get sold even in the local bazaars and the few traders that are coming in from nearby states. And that was like a trigger point for me that, okay, why don't we work something around it? Some bit of help from Delhi, some people came in, permissions that were required because it's a forest belt that is inhabited by vulnerable tribes in the country. And we taught them to make a turmeric bar. It's a bathing bar that just uses hand pound turmeric and a bit of glycerin. And today, this turmeric bar is 3 UN SDG compliant gold standard, a case study at TIS Bombay, where it is shown that how the Kondha Adivasi women have been able to add a layer of financial independence without disturbing their ecosystems and routine, which is still 100% forest based. So we've been able to create a balance around it. And it started with one village. This was the start. And today we have also enabled, in a small way, um, that the newer generation of these Adivasi kids come back to the village instead of picking up local contractual jobs, come back, get engaged in local products, local ingredients, impact projects, and it's just a journey. But why are we even, talking about it? It is just to warm you up to this massive understanding of tribal identities in India, which I often used to consider similar as rural ecosystem. So let's first spend like 5 minutes, and what I'm going to do is, since I have about half an hour, we understand a bit of tribal ecosystem. What is the current context? What was there historically? And how, from the point of tourism, what challenges and opportunities does it have massively to tap? And why should we even talk about it? Like a lot of people always keep asking me whenever I go to events that if they are so vulnerable, they are so remote, why should we disturb them? It's a very good question. And I think even if you guys won't ask, I will want to answer that question. Um, so, yeah, welcome to the indigenous communities. I am not going to go into details of that. But so, if I talk about indigenous, what is it? And I was actually looking for definitions, and on Google, it's like a lot of definitions. It starts from Scotland and things like that. But World Bank kind of defined indigenous in a very interesting way, which I'm going to read from my notes. It says culturally distinct societies and communities. The land on which they live are inextricably linked to their identities, culture, livelihoods, their physical and spiritual being, right? So, indigenous communities in India, if we talk about today statistically, there are about 645 tribes. But मुझे ऐसा लगता है unofficially there would be about 700. And out of which, now interestingly, this was an eye opener for me much later than I moved to Orissa, that in India there are about 75 listed particularly vulnerable tribal groups. Now, when we talk about PVTGs, which is particularly vulnerable tribal groups, it means that less than 10,000 of them exist on Earth. They usually are characterized by declining or a stagnant population. Number two. Number three, that they usually are very remote and may or may not be battling economic backwardness. And fourth, and very important, is they are dependent on pre-agricultural technology, which means they don't even practice agriculture as a means of their livelihood. They are 100% forest dependent. And to my surprise, like a lot of people in my community, I used to feel that the northeast part of the country is so rich in tribes, that's where tourism is happening, the Nagalands, the Arunachals. And to my surprise, when I started reading about actual tribal identities, Orissa has the highest number of PVTGs in the country. That is 13 out of the total 62, followed by Andhra Pradesh, which is 12, and the rest is about 7, 8, which is Chhattisgarh, Bihar, a bit of Madhya Pradesh. Again, a very rich tribal identities and communities ecosystem. And then, of course, we have all of us have heard of the Jarawas and Andamans and how they've been isolated. So Andaman has one tribe, Nagaland has one, but I realized that this eastern part of the country is sitting on this massive, intangible heritage that is totally untapped. And it is going away very, very fast. Because what's happening is the mobile phones that we are carrying is also carried by them now, thanks to all the technologies and the big corporate giants. The plastics that we are consuming, a slightly more cheaper version is entering their hearts as well, and they are also discarding it. Their aspirations are just as similar to ours as we consume TikToks and the Instagrams. And that leads to a very fast depletion of heritage, also because the tourism in eastern part of the country has traditionally been concentrated either on the Bengal borders, a bit here and there, like negligible amounts, probably for if you go down south, but Orissa primarily for the temple tourism, the Puri Jagannath Yatra, but nothing around the tribal or indigenous tourism. Similar for MP, I would say not in a big way, but I think a lot of jungle lodges are now tapping this massive experience-based tribal experiences, I would say. And same for Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, a lot of political issues have been, it's been there since centuries. So if we go back to history also, I was realizing that if we talk about tourism and the documentation that was done, and it was very surprising because I did not find information about it. So for any tourism activity to penetrate, or let's say a hotel to start, or an institution to start, or a DMC to start working there, he should have basic information, which was lacking. And that documentation has been done in three parts historically. Like if we go back to colonial times, pre-1940s, it was the documentation on Naga Hills that covered a bit of your Arunachal, Meghalaya, and massively the Nagaland. It was all called the Naga Hills, massively documented, photos captured. And then, of course, there was a lot of accessibility that ensured a bit of tourism that came into this side. If we talk about the next segment, it was called the Danda Karanya documentation. It is also mentioned in the Ramayana of India, one of the deepest and the most unsafe forest belt of eastern India. So Dandakaranya covered the documentation around and history of tribal communities and how to access, how do they look, what are their cultures, their festivals, was covered around the states of now Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, a bit of Andhra border and Orissa border. This was their coverage. And the third and the last documentation was called the Highlanders of the East, which is where I now live, which covers massively the area that covers from the Andhra border, which is Araku Valley, Vishakhapatnam, and now covers a bit of southern Orissa, which is Koraput, Malkangiri, and all of these areas completely inhabited by tribes to date. And thankfully, till today, as we are speaking, we are able to retain the tribal communities still live in the original formats, giving us immense opportunity to open up to mindful and slow tourism in real sense. So let's get to the meat of the talk now that I've given like a overview of what we are talking about. That what was happening so far, even till today, I can talk about this. So I live in this area, as I spoke to you, in the district of Koraput, which lies about 80, 90 kilometers from the nearest airport city of Vishakhapatnam, and on the border of Chhattisgarh and Andhra in Orissa. And the tourism, if I have to say it, the late 1990s, or you all will still agree, that it started with a lot of face value of tribals. It was face driven. So Arunachal started with Apatani's tourism. Still, you would say when it talks about, you would just see women with tattooed faces when it comes to tribal tourism, right? Slowly the things are changing. So of course, Arunachal has started the Orange Festival that talks about the agricultural bit of Pasighat. Then you have the Zero Music Festival, so that, you know, they're making their own ways very mindfully so that people can also absorb their local cultures, the local produce. And then Nagaland was again around head hunting, which was primarily it was archaic, it was not practiced, but that fascination drove the tourism. It was not around existing living heritage, that what is being practiced now, what are the traditions now? Is there any shamanism that is being practiced? What are their circular lifestyles they produce? It was much ignored because face value kind of sold, but now things are changing, and it's changing very fast. Also, that brings me to the second part of the talk, which is that what we are missing on. I think we are missing on a lot of intangible heritage that is depleting at a rate faster than our mobile phones get outdated. Now, I'll tell you why it's happening. Now, the people who are the policy makers, whether it is in the tourism infrastructure or political infrastructure, are people who have actually not lived in these belts, right? So they push policies which may be related to education, healthcare, introducing an eco-resort in a forest area, little knowing that if I educate a certain community that is a vulnerable tribe, I need to also introduce the language and not teach them just English and Hindi, because that language is very critical for them from all the perspectives, right? It can be as simple as constructing their huts in vernacular manner using the local ingredients or the things that are available locally. And instead pushing them, let's say, a chief minister fund that allows them to make pakka houses, which is great, but then it also ignores the traditional forms. So if I have to divide this intangible heritage of indigenous communities from a tourism perspective, there are four major baskets. Food is primarily the top ones. We see the big ones like Oma, we see the locavores, we see Siennas, we see Jol from Bangkok, Phuket. Now get their top chefs getting into these indigenous belts to forage, identify the right ingredients, and interpret modern food. And people are ready to pay a lot for that. So food is a major basket that's coming up. And the second basket that I feel is architecture. Great for designers. I think yesterday we had a talk around museums as a muse. It is still, in eastern part of the country, I can proudly say that the architecture is not tourism driven. The huts are still, to some extent, 70 to 60% in this bracket where people are, or Adivasi communities are still making those huts for their own living and not for a certain festival or not for you to photograph. So you would still have elements that actually a mindful group can go see, live with them, things that we don't see now. So architecture is the second bucket, as design students, as museums, or even tourism. The third bucket that I massively see is festivals. Now, these are festivals like India, also festival tourism, or is divided primarily into four: the Holi, Diwali, Dussehra. Indian weddings is a big thing now coming up. I think a lot of inbound tourists pick up on Indian weddings. They love to see our weddings. And then, of course, Durga Puja. It's one of the major revenue generators in East India. But I feel that there are also a lot of hyper local festivals that are very interesting to see. They have a beautiful marriage of shamanic and forest-based energies. Like you have the Sarhul in Jharkhand, you have the Madhais in Chhattisgarh, you have the Danda Yatras in Orissa. Beautiful festivals that can be captured by a lot of DMCs, properties that are existing in this belt to tap that easy, group tours that can be lapped up for this. And also because they have fixed dates, so you can plan things ahead. And these are things that have been ignored. Also now what is happening is, I spoke about it briefly, that the newer generation of Adivasi communities don't want to be photographed in their faces wearing beads or probably sitting and doing a dance. They would want to be seen as decision makers, as artists and not artisans. So that is also one of the reasons that they are becoming rebels. They don't want to follow what their grandfather or their father did or their mother did. So there has to be a change in narrative. Are they the ones who are guiding you to the villages? Like Arunachal follows that model beautifully. If you go to Zero Music Festival, they have local guides who are boys and girls from the local villages who are not dressed in their traditional attires, but they do it so beautifully. They would wear like an off-shoulder and a mekhala, or they would put a gale, which is their traditional skirt, and nice high boots. And you see that change that is happening in these tribal communities. And that wants to be, I feel that that should be the way ahead of how tourism should be taken and not on the face value. So of course, I think I've spoken a lot about some more examples before I talk about the challenges and the opportunities, which is like a running commentary I'm giving. Madhya Pradesh, I think you are already working. It's lapped up really fast. Beyond what is happening around the villages where tiger sanctuaries are, the traditional Gondi art has been picked up amazingly well by Japanese and Australians. It is so surprising to see that we have a Gond art museum coming in Osaka. Few Padma Shris, like Sham Singh Bhajju and all, they have done some beautiful art to interpret that into modern forms in Japan and Australia in terms of living culture. So they are not just working with designer brands, but they are also working on integrating it in lifestyle products. And that's where it's a win for tribal communities. You make that art eternal, right? I'll also give you a similar art. So Gondi art from the Gondwana land of MP Chhattisgarh used to be a wall art. And now it's changing into a lifestyle art. But a similar dying art, which is called Saura art of Orissa, is a shamanic art form, and it's completely died down. Like people no more practice it on their walls because there's a lot of conversion also that has happened. And what you see of that art is mostly cheap copies that are sold in the capital of Orissa for 100 rupees or 200 rupees. So such interventions like what has happened to Gond art is needed on a larger scale. So we need more interventions around it. Open community culture of Chhattisgarh, I think tourism has really, really worked amazingly well. Of course, there are few individuals who are taking this baton ahead. So we have Shakil Rizvi ji, I think Shiva you've met. Then we have few companies like Unexplored Bastar who actually take you down to the brass tacks of these villages, which are difficult to access, makes you live with them, appreciate it, and then talks about cultures that are not documented or are documented from colonial perspectives. Just to give you an example, Chhattisgarh has a culture of ghotul, which is where once you turn adult as a male or a female, you are allowed to live freely under the same roof for days together to discover your own affinity or discover your own partner, which is something unheard in India to a point that it was considered illegal. And Ghotul has been practiced for centuries now. It's an institution in itself where a hut is constructed outside the house to give them enough independence. And imagine now that Ghotul is picked up by a lot of tourists just to absorb that how it's been practiced as an institutional practice for the tribal communities. And it's beautiful to understand that entire ecosystem. And Chhattisgarh has been doing this beautifully. When it comes to Orissa, a lot is being done around crafts. While I still feel that what we are doing is tip of the iceberg, considering the rich tribal community depth that we have, there are few initiatives being taken towards crafts. I feel embroidery is becoming big. Coffee is becoming great. And I feel that has a lot of takers, whether it is inbound or domestic tourism, to have coffee plantation experiences. Because in this belt of the country, we have tribal communities growing their own coffee, grinding it, taking out the beans, not roasting it, of course, but it is going all that to a level, to even a level that for everyday drinking, they have their own green coffee beverage. Like they do that every day. They're drinking that every day. So it's not just for selling. So you actually see all of those little elements being practiced in daily lifestyle. Then, of course, we work with one tribe right now in Barmer, which is the India-Pakistan border of Rajasthan, where a lot of tourism happens around Jaisalmer, Jodhpur, of course, Jaipur is there, a bit of Bikaner. But Barmer is more or less ignored because it doesn't have a lot of interesting things like forts, something that's very tourist palatable. But then pastoral community tourism is becoming big in Barmer somehow. So you have this Raika community, and there's a beautiful book I would want you all to read. It's called The Desert Wind. It's written by Robinson Davidson. She was a lady who actually was traveling the Australian deserts with camels, and then she came to India in the 80s, and she observed that this Raika tribal community, Raikas we call them, and they move from entire Thar desert with camels in search of right vegetation. And that's where she got 2, 3 camels, and she just walked with the nomadic tribes. And it's a beautiful account which led to certain companies today to go back to the roots and introduce pastoral community tourism, where you walk with the tribes, village to village, understanding desert ecosystems, the vegetation, the food that is coming in, the little things that come, even I would say the fauna that is there of the desert. So there are so many layers when we talk about tribal ecosystem or tourism. And of course, I've spoken about food, in a big way. Like, it was very interesting. I'm going to give you an example. There's this tribe, Dongriya Konda. I think when I was showing the video in the morning, there was a tribe that was embroidering a shawl, right? And they are called one of the most remote tribal communities of Orissa, very famous for waging a war against the big mining giants. And today, they still live in the highlands, extremely inaccessible. There's a particular craft or a shawl that they embroider, which is GI tagged. It's called the Geographical Indication Tag by the country. And while the government has given the tag, they are not able to enable the tribal communities to produce it, ironically. Because for that to happen, you need to establish a very one-to-one relationship, which will take me to the last point of my presentation today, that how do we actually go about doing this? So I'm talking about penetration, I'm talking about mindful tourism that can go in food and festivals and crafts and so many other areas. How do we actually do it? So coming back to this story, so we have been working with these Dongriya Kondas for now 2 years, and my own startup, I mean, of course it is turmeric, 70% of my bread, butter, no cheese, is turmeric. But when the turmeric project kind of stabilized, I have just started to work with these smaller tribal communities around crafts and majorly their revival and documentation, because every motif they work on has got a meaning. So interestingly, I was working with them, and one day, and they grow pineapples, they are medicinal healers. So Dongriya Konda traditionally have 245 herbs documented to heal different kind of diseases, whether it's a fracture, whether it is pneumonia or most cholera, for example, one of the deadly diseases. They've never ever taken a medicine. Of course, they are different. I mean, it'll take a different whole together ballroom to discuss what they did when pandemic was there. It's an interesting story. I would not want to cover it in this platform. So yeah, one day we were eating and suddenly they bring this amazing grain to me. And of course, it was quinoa. And I was like, are you growing this here? They don't know it's quinoa. They've got a local name to it. And it is sold for 5 rupees a kilo in the Adivasi heart of Dongriya Konda. And it is quinoa, as raw as it can get. And of course, this belt also has almost all the millet varieties. And that was also the reason that last year when the Indian government introduced the year of millets, Orissa did magnanimous work because they are growing a lot of varieties of millet by the indigenous tribes, of course. So now coming to the last bit, I do not know what's the time now, right now. What are the challenges and why are we even talking about tourism in these? I mean, in an ideal scenario, these tribes should be left as is. That would have been a more idealistic sort of thing. But as I've been talking about in my talk here and there, that the change is already happening. Even if we don't want, it is happening because they are influenced by a lot of urban culture that is fast penetrating into these communities. Whether it is phone, it's internet, everything is accessible. You have roads, thanks to the government, going right up to their villages now. So the change is inevitable, it's already happening. But that change is not checked. It means that it ignores all of the intangible heritage values that they used to carry and pushes urban policies in an unchecked manner to them, enabling the beautiful cultures that they carry to just go away. And now, as a matter of fact, you will see that a lot of these people, they don't speak their native languages, they don't follow the similar architecture. I mean, it's changing. And I also feel that if we don't do it, in any case, it'll go. So we have few years before such kind of, um, you know, I feel mindful tourism, experiential-based, impact-based projects should come in so that more and more newer generation of tribal communities get engaged in these kind of activities, and heritage is taken forward at least for a few more centuries, at least 1 century, I feel. So that's one. Number two is, I feel, non-documentation. Tourism also brings a very important part, which is documentation, which is never hardly spoken about. You know, you would document, you would make content, you would write a few things, which is almost non-existent if you do not carry that activity, right? And that is also a major issue because historically these tribes do not, it's all oral traditions. So that also makes a very good point that tourism should be a part of these communities in some manner because it also ensures documentation of the massive values they carry. Um, all right, so yeah, and how do we move ahead? I mean, there is just one way, I feel: co-create, collaborate. There are a lot of individuals doing some beautiful work at the grassroots. I won't say me, I'm doing my turmeric work. But there are a lot of amazing individuals, smaller companies, that hotels, properties, DMCs can get in touch. And why is that? Because they have strong relationship with these tribal communities. Also, a beautiful thing about indigenous tourism in eastern or northeast part of the country is increasing availability of infrastructure, like airports. Arunachal Pradesh, which is the largest northeast state of the country, did not have airports for the longest time. And now they have 4 airports, and beautiful ones at that, connecting the entire state. When it comes to Orissa or Chhattisgarh, we have direct flights to Jabalpur. We have flights to Vishakhapatnam, which gives you instant access to the Andhra-Orissa border. And similarly, I'm sure that there are other parts of the country. I'm not dwelling into that. So you have access, you have infrastructure, you have the right kind of individuals, and I feel that is the way ahead to make a big impact in terms of mindful, indigenous, impactful tourism. And yeah, that's my time. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions. Okay, you do not have to rag me. Yeah, please. Yeah, yeah, the very good question. I mean, as I spoke in my last bit, it's just the network. There are people doing amazing work with the communities, whether it is Chhattisgarh or Orissa or, for that matter, the Araku belt, the tribal belt, or Arunachal. It's a matter of connection. Of course, there are. We just have to, and internet is, and I feel that's a great bridge because as a experience based agency, you can't touch every tribal community, but the person who's hyper local there can help you bridge that gap, and that'll be the right approach than you starting anew towards this, because it'll take years to build that kind of connections. I mean, it took me, I'll give you a very interesting example. So we started our turmeric project in Koraput in 2022. Um, yeah, and we started retailing to friends and family in August 22. And by December 2022, we had started our first engagement with the UNDP agency in Guatemala. After that, so all of this was happening. I still remember September 2022, the turmeric started. We started work with 2 villages. Now we work with 5 Kondha villages. And obviously, it's needless to say that even as a tourist, when you go to these tribal villages, you don't know their language, and we don't know their language. It's vice versa. But there's a connection, right? So I'm visiting, I'm living in that village anyway. So I'm visiting them, we are working together. These women won't talk to me. Like everything is happening. We are delivering results, the product is coming out, but they just won't talk to me because one, obviously, I'm an outsider, but they could realize that, okay, she's living there, but either maybe they were shy or what was the block in their head. And it was one of the weddings that I was invited to where they were hand poking each other. That was my, so it's about building relations. So what I did was I had to offer my body in literal sense that, okay, you just go hand poke me, whatever it takes. And I still remember the first hand poke they did, I was wincing with pain. It's still incomplete. But after that, now I'm their muse. Whatever part of the body they want, they go hand poke it. But so basically, coming back to the point, it takes relationships. So obviously, you would want to get in touch with those individuals and smaller agencies that are already working. And there are enough and more to start that. There's a plenty in all of these states. Yes. Oh, they do tattoo by hand. Yeah. And the ink is also locally sourced, basically a suit of a lamp that they are, yeah. All right, thank you so much. Okay, yes. Right. Right. Yeah. 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 Yes. I feel that any kind of tourism, like sustainability, is not black and white. Yeah. So basically, his question is that there's always a dilemma. When you initiate a certain work, let's say you introduce a work which is initiating tourism to understand fermentation practiced by tribal communities. So what will happen is if you scale it up and if you have regular people coming in, or let's just assume you set up a SHG unit that is fermenting the local flowers in a particular manner for selling. Now, traditionally, they were doing it house to house, and everyone does it, right? Now, his point was that when you bring a certain intervention, a certain group of tribal communities will get impacted positively, whereas the rest will just remain as is, and there'll be a certain divide that will happen. So, is it ethical or is it right to do that? So it's a very, very good question, and I'll give you example of MP only. And probably I can give you an example that happened with us. So with Madhya Pradesh, I forgot to talk about this. I was speaking about pastoral tourism. I spoke about modern food. I have to tell you that tribal communities of East and Northeastern India are the best liquor masters. They can ferment goddamn anything. You give them a papaya, guava, a cherry, a flower, they can ferment anything. Like if you see historically, Bonda Highlanders of Orissa are one of the best fermenters in India. And when I go there, I will ask them, where do you get papaya? They'll just say up. It's forests. Everything is up. Whatever the forest produce at that point of the season, they ferment it. So coming back to your question, there are two liquors that have become really big. So mahua was illegal actually to sell, locally. So they came up with, there were two interventions, which is mahuli now. It's being sold, in a proper manner. What happens is initially that divide will be there. Yes, there will be certain villages who may adopt, who may question and may not join. The whole idea is slowly you bring these interventions to a point. What is the motive? The motive is that newer people who get engaged in this bricklin work, in going to nearby cities like Raipur and all, should come back to villages and get engaged in more positive manner to at least preserve parts of the heritage, right? So I feel that now I'll give you an example of how we did the turmeric process. So initially now turmeric is being produced by this entire Eastern Ghats where we are living, right? And we started work with just 5 villages. We trained the women, and initially there were no orders, right? So we were like, okay, 5 villages are trained, but we can use only 1 village. And now suddenly this village was getting some money. Now the raw turmeric, which was being sold for 16 rupees a kg in an Adivasi hut, was suddenly turned into a turmeric bar. And if you see my website, it is priced above Forest Essentials and Kama Ayurveda. It is 299 Indian rupees, which is very expensive for a soap. And suddenly they were getting around 62% of that entire revenue in their pockets, the women, which is like a great jump. Now that was an issue initially. And then everyone wanted to be a part of this, but we were not having enough orders. But eventually what happened was that, let's say a third village, a guy who was a college educated guy, was stuck in Raipur with a low paying job, came back to handle my website, my QC. Another one joined a company that is building eco houses in Koraput. He got engaged there as a guide. So you may not be able to, let's say you start an intervention around textile or a food or let's say tourism. Everyone may not be absorbed directly, but you also can enable indirect employment that doesn't disturb the ecosystem. Also, that is a very, very important point. We should not ensure that factory-based tourism, cut and pre-decided packages can't be put. Like there can't be a copy-paste formula for impact-based or tribal-based tourism. It has to be very mindful. It has to be on the lines of Bhutan, which is low volume, high cost. It has to be like that. There's no other option. I do not know if I was able to, मैं आपका question का जवाब पूरी तरह दे पाई. Yes. Yes. Yeah. I know. Yeah. No, that's a very, very relevant question, and I do not know if I have an answer to this today. But I also want to tell you that India, uh, on a tourist map, is waking up to a lot of mindful tourism in terms of policies also. The work is really small. Like for the first time in Delhi, there was a tribal festival just organized few months back focusing around tribal produce and crafts. It's never happened in the history of India. Like never. We've had tons of craft exhibitions and festivals, never something that's just focused on tribes. Suddenly, we also see certain DMCs who are pushing, like I know for a fact that there's a DMC that operates to expose the Malkangiri bondas in a very mindful way that they say that not more than 8 people will go in a certain group, which is also divided in frequencies. So obviously when I say create, co-create and collaborate, it has to be hand in hand with the institution, which is, let's say, a government or a local authority, the local person who's actually working with the community, like the grassroots. It can be an agency, company, individual, and of course the DMC. What is their choice? How do they want to push it? So I feel that it's also like I had somewhere put that we have a first mover advantage of sorts when it comes to tapping impact tourism in eastern part of the country right now, because it's totally not happening right now. It's very minuscule, but I feel that that should not be misused, and I feel that once we have certain numbers, automatically there will be policy. I feel that that should be the case. They're not there right now, of course, not enough. Like the Leh case. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, I agree. I agree. Yeah, but it is a very gray matter. I agree to your point completely. Yes, yes, Shivya. Yes. 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 I agree. I agree. I agree 100%. I will tell you a very interesting thing. I was talking about the Dongriya Kondha community where we work, and I was talking about that quinoa story. So I was generally talking to the girls. Now, ideally, we would want that all of them should embroider in their free time. That's not the case. The girls are very aspirational. One of the girls there wants to open a salon in the hills, and why not? I mean, how can we uh, live in air cons and not expect them that they should be living in mud houses still? So the idea is that when we penetrate or we work around impact tourism, it should be a balance where newer Adivasi communities are hand in hand working with you to preserve certain models the way they are. Like shamanic traditions are big in India till today. Will they be practiced by newer generations? Yes, to some extent, if they see that there is mindful appreciation of that and not just, camera clicking, like narratives. So let's not get into detail of that, but it's a very thin bridge. And I think that thin bridge also involves the say of the local communities as well, which is very, very important. I mean, I feel that if my women, I always feel that there's this whole narrative around craft tourism. We are supporting artisans, we support, why don't you? I think it is them supporting us, and that's why we exist. They were called first citizens of the world for a reason. They were the first. And from them, the whole traditions have gone, come to us. So I feel that it has to be their will at the first place. There are communities still today who are not open to sort of exposing them to tourists. It's fine. But some are really keen. And I feel if that is there, then the balance and the whole, co-creation should come in. So, yeah. Yes. Okay. So if I understand you completely, your question is that is there any literature that is existent? Oh, yeah, that way it is entirely spoken. Of course, there is a lot of literature in local language. There's a book I'm reading right now. It is about Gondi. So, if you, I do not know, if you guys are aware about Madhya Pradesh, which is the central part of the India, there was a concept called Gondwana land, which is considered the center of the earth as per them, and then they have traced out the whole legend that how from this, different civilizations broke. And of course, it's written in a local language, and there are less translations done. That said, the entire literature of tribal communities massively in India is around animism, which is forest, sun, and moon, and the stories around that, because for them, they are the deities and the legend, and how they utilize, how the festivals are surrounded by it, and how the cultures, coming back to the definition of indigenous, that the land is so inextricably woven into their physical and spiritual identities that they are one with it. So much so that till today, I will be showing few of very compelling images in my last session today evening with Philippa. Animal and human sacrifice in certain parts of the country is still valid. For them, it is as equal as they being consumed by the deeper forests of the country. It's like they feel that they are one. So definitely there is a lot of history, but most of it is oral. And the most concerning part of tribal identities is language. We have already lost a lot of it because the generation prior to us is also not speaking the traditional languages, and it's not documented. But I also feel that we still have some time, and I feel tourism is a great way to get into this. Yes.
So my question is primarily related to monetization and pride. I think that kind of works hand in hand in my, sometimes I've seen that, especially with the tourism space. Have you seen that with the tribal community, as soon as you've seen that they're monetizing their craft in any way, has that related to pride, in turn having the idea of maybe preserving certain crafts and maybe utilizing that language to perform?
100%. I feel especially for newer generations, um, they they carry aspiration. Like the newer Adivasi kids who are millennials born after the 1980s have same aspirations as all of us sitting here, and they are driven by how they are perceived in outside society. They don't want to be, as I've been discussing, seen in traditional attire. So to give you an example, there's a particular cluster called Kotpad, and it's a beautiful textile cluster in India. And the South Delhis and the Sobos of Bombay picks up Kotpad textile at a very high price. A beautiful textile locally dyed by the bark of a certain tree, and the ink is called aal, and the dyeing happens through cow dung, and it takes about 6 months to dye that, and it fetches a great price. And initially, the Kotpad fabric was 100% barter, which means that the forest tribes would get that organic bark, and in turn, the weaver who's sitting in slightly low lands would give them the textile woven, and you trade it with a goat or a powder. Now, what happened is Kotpad, the municipality, which is closer, introduced that, okay, let's just sell it also. Now, these people, they started tasting money. So, obviously, barter was gone. But the better part was that slowly mindful designers came into picture. They still follow the same practices, but they are getting better prices. And most importantly, there is a motivation in newer generation to still dye those clothes, weave those clothes, because they know that now today a sari is going to fetch me 30,000 or upwards of Indian rupees. And that's a great deal. And why should I stop that? There are more and more slowly people coming in to see this process, document it. So I feel monetization to a great extent, but again, that, coming back to that bridge of balance, I mean, we have seen the Jaipur case, that how block prints and all have been become so, abused. And so I feel that balance has to be there. And tourism is like a circle. You start somewhere, you develop a destination, it gets oversaturated, like Leh, and then you move to Spiti. But ultimately, it cannot be that you don't start the circle. That's also bad, I feel. Not touching tribal communities and letting them lose the heritage is also not an approach that we should be doing. So that I hope that I could answer your question. All right, thank you so much. Thank you.